Now, and again, this is Matthew writing. There's no chapters. There's no verses and everything else. So the next thing that Matthew writes is he goes 6 days later. Now, usually Matthew does not put a time frame like that. But after he was sitting there and he wrote and he said, "Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Then 6 days later, what does Jesus do? He takes with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and leads them up on a high mountain by themselves. And verse 2 says, "He was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun. His garments became white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared with him and talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, 'Lord, is it good for us to be here? If you wish, I will make 3 tabernacles here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah.'" Let's just stop right there because I want to just dive into this. Now, when you read Matthew 16:28, and it says, "Some of you will not taste death until you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." We sit there and say, "Well, I mean, does that actually mean him like coming on the white horse in Revelation?" You know, possibly. But you know, when you sit there and you take this, is that in Matthew's mind, because what happens, you're going to find out later on as we continue on, when they come down from the mountain, Jesus is going to tell them, "Don't tell anybody." So Matthew was one of those disciples that were down at the bottom of the mountain, and we're going to see what happened in a few minutes about that. He was one of the, and he had no idea what was going on. Okay, so when he writes this, he's heard it afterwards from one of the other ones. Okay, Peter reflects back to this when you read in 1 Peter. He talks about how he remembers what happened, stuff like that. But here's the thing that's key piece in here, is that it says in here that you'll see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. When you go to Revelation, chapter 1, John is sitting there and he hears this voice speaking. He turns around to look at the voice that is speaking, and he sees this person dressed brilliant, you know, bronze legs, dressed in white, golden slash. I mean, it's just a beautiful picture. And it's Jesus. Later on in Revelation, he's going to see Jesus again, and he's a slain lamb. So the whole point in here is whether this is actually them seeing Jesus in his kingdom or Jesus appearing as he appears in his kingdom. You know, is the point. Is that what Jesus does, and this is kind of neat, what Jesus does is he takes Peter, James, and John, 3 of them, to go up with him. And now you got to read all the other books. They fall asleep. You know, so let's go up to pray. So that's what Jesus told them in the other gospel. Let's go up the mountain and pray. They go up to pray. They fall asleep. We're going to see this again later on in Gethsemane. You know, but they fall asleep during their prayer time. When then Jesus is sitting there and he's talking to Moses and Elijah, and in the other gospels, and I think in Mark it says, hey, he's talking about his exodus. He's talking about the whole purpose, and he's already been telling the disciples up to the point. Paul's already brought this up several times. Man, they've heard it and heard it and heard it, and they still didn't recognize it. How dumb can they be? But they hear this. But he's talking to Moses and Elijah about his exodus, which I think is kind of cool, because it's Moses who represents the law. It's Elijah that represents the prophets. And all the way through the law and the prophets, the Old Testament, it points, I mean, it's just constant scripture, pointing to what Christ is going to do here on earth as a suffering servant, and then also what he's going to come do, which we'll see if we ever get to Revelation, what he's going to come do and establish his kingdom. If we understand the prophecies in the Old Testament that talk about his birth and his earthly ministry, and how true every one of those prophecies came true, we can have a confidence that the prophecy is coming up. Just like when you mentioned, Phil, all these preachers that are talking about the end times and everything else. Yeah. Why? Because these are proven prophecies. There have already been proven prophecies about his coming. There are going to be prophecies that we can have a confidence on that's still going to happen. And that's the key to faith, is that we can stand firm in God's word, knowing that He's true to His word. He's not going to, well, I kind of told you this, but it's not really going to happen that way. He's true to His word. And when we can have that kind of faith, we can't have that faith, we can't have that faith with people. I don't want you to have that faith in me, because I will fail. But we can have that faith, we can have that trust in God, knowing that whatever He says, it will come happen. He wants us to know. He wants us to know the truth. And so sitting here, and so that He gets transfigured. Now, transfigured, the word for here is metamorphosis in Greek. Okay? So where do we see metamorphosis in our world today? Something that changes.
Oh, caterpillar to butterfly.
Yeah, to a butterfly. Jesus, and I love this, because, Paul writes in Philippians, he says, he never, being God, never took His authority as God and boasted it in front of anybody. He does this in front of Peter, James, and John. Kind of interesting to see, and I'll talk about those three people in a second. He takes those three, it's a core group of folks. He takes those three and He's transfigured in front of them. And it was for them to see, even though they fell asleep. Now Peter gets, I love Peter because I'm too much like Peter. He just puts his mouth wide open before he really thinks through things, I think, sometimes. But he's with good intentions. Can we keep this together? Let's, what do we need to do here? Let me build a booth. Let's enjoy this. And all of a sudden, you're going to see here in a minute, a white cloud comes over. But Peter's this kind of guy. Now, why Peter, James, and John? And I think it's kind of cool. What happened to James after Jesus' resurrection? Anybody y'all know?
He actually took over the leadership.
No, wrong James.
Oh.
James died. He was the first disciple. Stephen was a martyr also, was a deacon. Mm-hmm. But James, the brother of John, was the first disciple to actually die. The James that you're talking about is the brother of James. He writes the book of James. Yeah. Okay? So the James that you read in Acts later on, that's the leader of the church, is not James, the brother of John. It's James, the half-brother, that grew up with Jesus, that, as you've seen in Matthew, and we'll see again, there's like, hey, you're kind of off your rocker here. Can you come over here a little bit? And Jesus said, who is my brother? Who's my sister? Who's my mother? Jude in the New Testament is also Jesus' half-brother. Okay? Neither one of these guys, when they write their letters, say, oh, I'm the half-brother of Jesus Christ. They write, I am a bondservant.
Did they know they were His half-brothers?
They grew up together.
They grew up.
Yeah, but Jesus was the oldest.
Right, Jesus was the oldest. They had no idea they were half-brother. They thought that in their minds, they most likely thought that Jesus was just Joseph's son.
Oh, okay.
Just like they were Joseph's son.
Right.
Eventually, these guys, and probably sisters too, realized that, hey, He really was the Son of God. But that was a hard concept. Just think. When you read it in Isaiah chapter 7, behold, there's going to be a virgin that's going to have a child. It's kind of like, that don't really happen. Sarah had to wait till she's 90 some odd years old before she had a child. There was other people other women who were old that had to wait. But to actually have a child that wasn't an earthly dad around, Mary hid all these things in her heart, it says in Luke. And stuff like that. I'm not even quite sure Mary was sharing all this stuff with Jesus or with the other siblings. And we have no idea what happened to Joseph later on. The only thing we know is that when it comes time, when Jesus is 33 years of age and comes to the crucifixion, the only person standing at the cross was Mary. And we'll talk about this again, but Jesus tells John, the brother of James, take care of her as she was like your mom. Why? Because John and James, John was probably a teenager. Okay? He was probably a very young man in his either in his teens or early 20s, where James could have been a lot older, but they fought like cats and dogs. They were the sons of thunder. I love that. But anyway, so what happens here is that they did this. And it's kind of interesting because later on, Peter, and I was going to say, James dies. Peter is going to be crucified, according to legends and stories. Peter's going to be crucified. You know, Jesus tells them that. You read this. You can read this in the last chapter of John. They're going to stretch your arms out. You know, they're going to, and then Peter in his little wise argument go, well, what about John? And Jesus said, don't worry about it. If I want him to see, me in my glory, he'll see it, but John does. John is the only disciple who actually lives to be 80, almost 90 years of age.
It doesn't.
And here's the key piece. When you study John's letters, so you got the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. A lot of those letters he wrote as an older man. And Jesus had already resurrected 30, 40 years ago. Some of these disciples have spread out. He made, we don't have the cell phones, we don't have Facebook and everything else. So Thomas and some of these other disciples, they spread out because of the persecution and everything else that's going on. John may have never heard from Timothy or Bartholomew or any of those guys. He probably knew that Peter had died. He probably heard that Paul had died. Here he was, an old disciple, and he's writing. When he's writing, I love this. When he's writing to a new generation of people who've never seen Christ. And so when he writes in 1 John, he says, I want you to know that you know. And I love that. John wants us, in his letter, I want you to know that you know. And that's what we need to have in our faith. We need to know that we know. We need to know our